and welcome to Varn Blog, and today is another Poetry and Poetics episode. I'm talking here with Ben Meyerson, who I know from two different worlds, the world of philosophy and history, a la our joint involvement in the members school at different times, and also as a poet. Ben is a writer and musician. I think you spend time in Spain and Canada these days, and you have the dubious distinction of, like me, having an MFA in poetry and a philosophy background, which dooms you to hell in most religions. And I believe you also have a PhD in comparative literature, so you get triple condemned. Okay, so you are in your pursuit thereof.
Yeah, ABD, which means that I guess like I am deep in the writing process right now, which is what I signed up for. So I was waiting for this the entire time. Yeah, exactly.
So we're going to talk about your most recent collection, Seguiriyas, which is a term from flamenco. I don't play guitar. I just play drums, which means I basically just count. But Seguiriyas itself is very interesting because its counting is a little different than standard classical guitar, which is about as much as I actually know about it. I mean, I know what it sounds like, and I know that it involves different counting. But I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to name your collection from Black Ocean after flamenco? Specifically that movement. Go ahead.
I mean, I suppose that like one thing that made it make sense to me was that like what flamenco represents is like this really interesting confluence of cultural influences that has been packaged in a very particular way within like a more unitary cultural sphere, because of course Spain underwent in the 15th and 16th and 17th centuries like a pretty thorough ethnic cleansing process of ethnic cleansing. So you have all these echoes of prior cultures that subsist within flamenco as these kind of called up memories. And yet at the same time, there is, like within the flamenco voice, there is like also a very immanent and close at hand, cultural identity that is other than what like the standard or mainstream Spanish cultural identity is, specifically due to the ways in which flamenco has been nurtured and developed by the Roma of southern Spain. Now, the Roma have been marginalized in various ways within Spanish society since roughly 1499. 1499 is the date of the first kind of declaration concerning the Roma by the Spanish crown, and that I guess othering that has gone through different phases of development has persisted, to the current day. Like still there are massive disparities, and so flamenco is this thing that has been taken as this Spanish national, as this emblem of Spanish national identity. It's been exported as such, in kind of a kitschy way that belies its true scope. A lot of people are like into like the frilly outfits and like the dancing. The dancing's great, but the core of flamenco is actually the cante, the singing, and the lyrics that are involved, the lyrics and the ways in which the lyrics correspond to the melodies. Everything else that in flamenco is revolving around accompanying the singing. So using the Seguiriyas as a palo, or a palo is like a flamenco form, the song form, that has a very particular history in terms of its reception. So a lot of the reception of flamenco in the Anglophone world has been through the poet Federico Garcia Lorca, right? And Lorca, along with the composer Manuel de Falla, kind of packaged certain flamenco palos, flamenco forms, into what they call cante hondo, or the deep song. And Seguiriyas is one of these. So for them, like the palos of cante hondo harken back to, like, you know, primitive Romani song. But regardless, so Seguiriyas has that kind of baggage to it, and that's kind of been subsumed within its practice. But then, you know, regardless of the truth of that claim or not, the truth of that claim is a little bit muddy. It's very hard for us to trace back these forms to their origins. But regardless of that claim, it's kind of gathered that baggage and taken it with and taken it on in the performance practice. And then beyond that, there's also like the specific lyrics that typically pertain to the Seguiriyas, which have to do with, you know, complaints about social injustice, you know, labor complaints, accounts of lost love, questions relating to generational memory, and you know, the death of one's parents, things like that. So I think that, you know, in using the term Seguiriyas, my goal was to kind of say, okay, so flamenco is this confluence of all these different things, all these different references, these echoes of different musical traditions and poetic traditions, you know, and this compendium that contains a kind of variable memory, both the Romani cultural memory and also the memory, a memory that encodes those that preceded the Romani in the social roles that the Romani came to occupy, specifically the Jews of Spain who were expelled in 1492, and the Muslims of Spain who were forcibly converted and then eventually expelled in 1609. So it's got all of that, as well as this kind of very specific vein of content that interested me. So for me, it became this kind of shorthand for diasporic memory, for like the recording of diasporic memory, or itinerant memory in various ways. And so in a certain sense, it also became like this thing against which I could elucidate some measure of my own diasporic sensibility as, you know, a Jewish person in North America, which so in that sense, the figure of Seguiriyas and the voice that Seguiriyas encodes becomes this this figure of historical solidarity, I could say, between various cultures. And to compound that, Seguiriyas as a word, you know, its root is seguir, which means to follow in Spanish. And so I kind of took that very literally on purpose and framed the collection as a way of following these different threads.
Yeah, I was reading poems from the collection. I was struck by, I mean, there's an interesting tension between what I know of like traditional Ladino poetry and then modern poetry like George Oppen, which I know that you read. So that I find that fascinating, because my inclinations are to approach this first from that point of view and then from a musical point of view, actually, like a literally musical point of view. But as I told you, I think like a drummer. So I think in rhythm. So I was looking for the rhythm and I'm like, I don't know. I'm not finding it exactly. So I preparing for this interview, I did some research in the origins of flamenco, and then I realized that even though I kind of know what it is, that I have no idea, and also apparently neither does anybody else. We know that it's associated with the Romani. We know that it's associated with Berbers and with Moors, but even the origin of the word, I found about 7 different possible origins. So I was like, okay, I got nothing. Some origins.
And in a lot of cases, each of them is about as implausible as the next as well.
Right. So I mean, but I find that's often true with diasporic memory. Like there are things that we can concretely nail down, and then there's stuff that we're like, I don't know, some people met some people and they said some things, and this is what we got. Like, but it is interesting. One of the things I get fascinated with flamenco is that its relationship to sung poetry and its relationship to rhythms are kind of different than other late medieval, early modern music, even from the Iberian Peninsula. And that to some way, to me, it's always been kind of ironic that that's like the national music we associate with Spain, because it's both incredibly Spanish because it's also incredibly like not really Castilian. So what were some of the other influences that went into this collection?
Like poetic influences or
poetic influences, historical influences. We're gonna tease all of it out. So
yeah, well, I mean, you kind of gestured toward a bunch of things.
I know.
So I mean, when it comes to flamenco, I was using it in this collection as much more of a conceptual figure. So I was not attempting to take flamenco rhythm and work it into the poetry. That's actually something that I'm working on right now. And
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because well, there's a lot of flamenco forms that are just like in fours. There's some that are in twos, but like what people like kind of glom onto is like, you know, the rhythms of the soleá, the alegría, seguiría, bulería, like these rhythms that are in 12, right? Or well, the bulería isn't really in 12 if you're playing it, but the others are. Bulería like kind of emerged out of a 12-beat compás. Compás is like the rhythm. It's like it's like a clock with 12, and it goes so there's there's an emphasis pattern, and the bulería kind of accelerated that and then abstracted it to the point where really if you're playing it, you're playing in threes with a cierre, which with a close that's like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 basically. So it's kind of a polyrhythmic in that sense. But yeah, the other ones are like definitively in 12. And what I've been noticing is that, so if you're writing in Spanish, it's hard to approximate those kinds of rhythmic constructions because Spanish as a language just doesn't have the rhythmic impact that English does. We've got like those hard Germanic syllabics, right? So as a result, like I don't. This hasn't really been done before in Spanish, to my knowledge. But in English, what interests me is like actually building meters that that map onto flamenco palos. So like thinking about like it's like there's this word hemiola, right, which is like, you know, like a rhythm that's divided in half, and each half is like counted differently, right? And that like partially encompasses what's happening in like the 12-beat compás, but in truth, like it's more complicated than that. So what interests me is like thinking through, okay, like where we can arrange the upbeats in particular ways, but like how are you doing the downbeats in the metrical line, right? Because, you know, if so like a soleá rhythm is like, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2. So that's like the 12, right? So it's the first half is like 2 emphases with 6 beats, and the second half is 3 emphases with 6 beats. So the problem is that in English, like there's this principle whereby like if you're reading a line and you start reading in like, let's say, iambic meter, and then you move to dactylic meter, the dactyls that you read are at the same pace as the iambs. In other words, like a 2-beat, like a bisyllabic foot takes the same amount of time as a trisyllabic foot to read. Bisyllabic foot is an acceleration. So I can't just have like, I can't just do like, you know, 2 like on one side like 2 dactyls and on the other side 2 iambs. It becomes more complicated than that. I have to find ways to clutter the rhythm. There's going to be more than 2 upbeats on like each side of the or more than 3 on the other side as well. It becomes more complicated. You have to like think in terms of double times and triple times and stuff. So I'm trying to puzzle my way through that. We'll see what happens with that. But in the book, it's really just a conceptual figure. So in terms of influence, I mean, Geoffrey Hill is a major poet for me. Has been ever since I was a kid. And so I think one of the oldest poems in the book actually is an elegy for Geoffrey Hill. He died in 2016, early July, and I remember because I was visiting some friends in New York, and we'd just done like the classic like July 4th, festival of excess, and so I was like hungover on his couch, and I like hear that I like go on my laptop and I hear that Geoffrey Hill has passed, and I started writing the poem from the end and eventually like reconstructed the beginning. So I would have been, that's got to be the oldest poem in the collection, because I would have been like 24. It was before I even started my MFA. And
Way to make me
that,
feel old, Ben. Go ahead.
but yeah,
I was 36 when
Hill,
Geoffrey Hill died. So go ahead.
But Hill was huge for me, and has been like like a kind of unceasing influence. But the influence has morphed. So by the time I kind of got into this book, I wasn't necessarily trying to write like Geoffrey Hill, but I had kind of internalized elements of what he does with like in terms of phrase making and the way he uses compression to make arguments in his poems. Like that has been a huge influence on me. Now, like a little bit later on, I discovered Nathaniel Mackey, and rhythmically, in terms of the way he manipulates breath, that was big for me as well. Like that was like a kind of mind-opening thing. Reading Splay Anthem, which was my first exposure to his work, was kind of transformative. And then, eventually I realized that like Mackey himself has written a little bit about flamenco, and so I kind of tried to think about how his internalization of like breath, the attenuation of breath, the breaking of voice, the raggedness, and the recursivity with that, the kind of historical or the recursivity of historical memory that something like vocal attenuation can produce in the enunciation of a poem. That for Mackey is what he's extracting from like Coltrane and from Dogon funeral rites and all of this stuff. But he also kind of puts flamenco into the mix there, among other things. So I start thinking about that in terms of flamenco, and then I start thinking about it in terms of certain kind of Jewish traditional practices like the Tekiyah Gedolah, the long blast of the shofar, and the way the purpose of that is to like attenuate the sound to as much as possible, to kind of stave off the failure of breath, even as you allow breath to fail. And so this kind of, for me, instantiates or kind of activates the two elements of voice in the body. The first is its ability to make meaning, right, by sounding, by communicating, and the second is its status as this kind of somatic property, this telluric thing that emerges out of us without any intent. Like when we're startled by something, or when we yawn, or when we cry, or when we laugh. And so the latter kind of precedes signification, precedes communication, and then the former is posterior to it. And this kind of produces this temporal loop, right? And so this is how I kind of repurpose Mackey's framing of things. Mackey doesn't put it in those terms, but I do, because I find myself needing to systematize things a little bit more. And as a result, that's like the purpose of the voice as a figure throughout the collection. It's this desire to produce this spatiotemporal loop that activates historical memory and dredges up all that which has been kind of suppressed beneath the surface.
Mm. I mean, it's interesting. I wouldn't. I love both those poets, Mackie and Jeffrey Hill's one of my absolute favorites. I've like read Tenebrae and King Log probably about 25 times, and I
King
agree
Log is
with
probably
you.
my favorite.
Yeah, it's Hill is up there. I mean, even though they're completely different kinds of poets, Hill and Charles Olson are poets I return to over and over and over and over again. And it's partly because they're difficult and they don't care.
Yes,
like,
yes.
like it's unapologetically like we are
You
making
can't
an argument,
apologize. You can't.
right? We are making an argument through both dense historical reference and gnarled syntax and scansion. You really actually do kind of have to scan the poem to start getting the meaning. And there is a rhetoric to that Hill is articulating. And when I think of someone like Mackie, I've always been like impressed by Mackie's ability to just kind of almost create forms. I mean, he's not explicitly an analogous form person, but and for listeners who don't know, that's people who find forms from like watching different things. And when we're talking about adopting flamenco to poetry, that would be an analogous form because it hasn't been formalized as a poetry set in English yet, I think.
No,
I should always be careful when I say that because there might
as
be
far as
somebody
I'm
who's doing
aware.
it.
I mean, there might be somebody out there doing it, but if they are, I don't know who they are. And if you're watching this, whoever that is, like hit me up. I want to talk. But
so I find that interesting that you seem very interested in the not just the oral, and for those of you listening, that's AURAL. That's not, but the cymatic, the rhythmic, and I did notice that in your poetry even when I read it. But as I said, like it was clearly you weren't trying to mimic flamenco or Seguiriyas in the poems. I was like even counting like this line's not long enough for that.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
And then I'll admit that I cheated and read an interview that was like, oh, okay. But it is interesting that you are actually experimenting with the form. One thing I will say about a lot of contemporary poetry, and I say this as a person who writes, what people often think is free verse. Now, I say they think it's free verse because it doesn't rhyme. But usually I actually have some pretty crazy metrical counts that I'm actually trying to do. And I've realized that outside of very specific MFAs, almost no one teaches scansion anymore.
They don't even
the
teach
poets.
scansion in the MFA. I mean,
I took
had
one prosody class, so
yeah. I had a generally good experience on my MFA, but like what I noticed is that like a lot of people came in not knowing scansion because people are coming in with different backgrounds, right? And if they didn't know scansion already, they probably had to learn it on their own time and like just corner a professor in their office or something because it was assumed that like you already knew how to write. The purpose of the MFA wasn't to teach you how to write; it was like to help you write your book, So yeah, I mean, and as a result, like what's happening, I mean, this is like a complaint that I have is that you get people who are like coming out of MFA programs and like, are now qualified to like teach poetry at universities who've never been like taught properly how to scan. Maybe they can count out like iambic pentameter or something, but like the kind of more involved stuff, it's not there. It's a failing, and it's kind of baked into the system, I think. And I'm not sure how it can be remedied, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of assumptions in the MFA system. I'm going to bracket out and allow us to go down this detour before I go down another one. But I am, as a person who has an MFA, and actually, weirdly, when you said you like Hill, I was like, oh wow, we share taste. And we're both Sephardic. I don't know what that means.
I'm Ashkenazi.
But... Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Whew. I was like,
yeah.
Okay. Well, I didn't know because I was like, maybe you're half Ashkenazi, half Sephardic.
No,
Meyerson, that's not.
I'm Ashkenazi with parents who are both scholars of medieval Spain, so that's the.
Okay. Yeah. I am Bulgarian, Sephardic, and Scotch Irish in ancestry. So it's And even saying Bulgarian Sephardic is weird because what that means is we escaped Spain, went through the Ottoman Empire, and ended up in Bulgaria, and then left.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, you know that there was a flamencologist in the 1960s, Hipólito Rossi, who like went and heard, I think it was Bulgarian like Sephardic Jewish music, and he was like, this sounds similar to this flamenco form called the petenera, and the petenera has a couple of lyrics that refer to Jews, in particular to like the Jewish absence. There's a famous lyric, "Donde vas, bella judía, tan compuesta y deshora," and then she answers, "Voy en busca de Rebeco, que está en una sinagoga." So it's like, where do you go, beautiful Jewess, so composed and untimely? I go in search. Rebecca is like Jacob, so I go in search of Jacob, who's in a synagogue, which is of course like the context of this being like, you know, this is post expulsion when, you know, the synagogues have been totally repurposed and there are no more Jews left. And I guess so. Hipólito Rossi is like, oh, the petenera actually is based on like must be based on like an old Sephardic song that was then taken by the Bulgarian, the Sephardic Jews to various places, and now like has been, you know, passed down in this Bulgarian Sephardic community, and it's this analog to the petenera. The truth of the matter is almost certainly that this was him just like going off on into fantasy land, you know. But the fact that like that people are searching for these correspondences to me is so interesting.
Yeah, I do feel like often I'm reading Isidore of Seville's etymologies and people are just making shit up. But which is fine.
You have to make your own, yeah, I mean, like, especially when you ethnically cleansed your country, you have to find ways to make your own mythologies, you know.
How much of the content, the kind of let's say the semantic content of this book, do you feel has that echo of ethnic cleansing in the background?
Quite a lot. I mean, like the poem Alcante is very much about that, and references it somewhat directly. There's a cento in there that, like, you know, a lot of the lines that it's lifting, and it's taking stuff from flamenco lyrics, from, you know, various letters that were written by, you know, Muslims and Jews, you know, about their treatment at the hands of, you know, the Christians after the Reconquista. You know, there's a lot of poems by Sephardic Jews who were expelled from Spain, and also there's some contemporary Sephardic poetry, some contemporary poetry by Romani poets. It's a 3-part cento, so I was able to fit in a lot of stuff, but a lot of the material in that, and also, you know, the way it's assembled kind of encodes precisely, you know, these histories of ethnic cleansing and the ways in which, you know, memory is suppressed, and how one should deal with historical memory and the memory of such events. So there's definitely plenty in there that kind of tries at least to confront this material, but, you know, I'm always leery of being like too direct with that stuff as well, because I think that there's, I mean, and this might be like a kind of not the best way of putting it, but I think there's a point at which when you're too direct, you risk, you know, you risk it feeling like you're just beating a drum. It's inelegant. And you know, if the goal is to produce work that's effective, right? Like there's a point at which like over determining the message, so to speak, actually detracts from the effectiveness of the rhetoric. And that's something that I've always been perhaps oversensitive about. Like whenever people are too insistent, I kind of, my reaction is like, okay, I get it now. Like what else? How is this being packaged? So as a writer, I think I am always trying to, you know, inject that content into things without making the thing solely about that. So like I can write a love poem that's also about diasporic memory, and just have it kind of vacillate indeterminately in between those two strata. as opposed to, you know, just writing about diasporic memory in and of itself, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm often writing about diasporic trauma, but I also don't like writing directly about diasporic or Southern American or race relational trauma, because I wanted to be there, but I don't. I, to put it directly, I just think a lot of didactic poems are bad. So,
Yeah. I mean,
like,
I didn't want to say it so baldly, but yeah, I mean, there's something about like there's a place in contemporary poetics where like aesthetics and technical execution runs up against um, against like virtuous desire, I would say. Um, and that's like, I think that like if you're writing, that's like probably the hardest thing to navigate, you know, because you can like, you know, be super comfortable with like all the techniques that you need. You can be able to do whatever you want, but when it comes to actually making the decisions, then you have to walk this tightrope, and the tightrope's unavoidable. It's something that like I don't think I'll ever be comfortable with, and maybe it's good that I'm not comfortable with it because it means that I'll continue trying to be careful. But yeah, it once the virtuous desire takes over, it's really hard to write a good poem. You have to tamp that down and find ways to channel it into the technique, as opposed to just making it the thing that you're shouting from the rooftops.
Yeah. You know, as a person who teaches high schoolers and sometimes judges performance poetry, both slam and otherwise, I find that I am increasingly a minority in being frustrated in overly didactic poetry that just wants to yell their virtues out, but also can't do it musically or in a way that I'll remember in 35 minutes. So it's a problem, and I try to be forgiving about it. But I do think the two things are somewhat related, and that is this lack of formal training in musicality. Because, like I said, I took one prosody class in my entire education. There was only one offered, and it wasn't in the MFA. Now that I think about it, I was taking it for like restoration literature, so that I could do scansion of like Alexander Pope. So
Yeah, I mean, my prosody training was like mostly by myself and a little bit in like taking undergrad classes, but like a lot of it was just like me really going down rabbit holes, and then asking certain people for guidance. But
yeah,
yeah,
a lot of it for me also was just like having basic knowledge of music, and I kept on being like, okay, how do we count beats? I'm
yeah. I
like,
mean,
that was
I will say that like if you want to actually understand meter in poetry, reading about what meter is in musicology and what rhythm is in musicology and the distinction between rhythm and meter. I mean, if you're a poet who knows how to scan a poem, and can write like you can write blank verse, you can write in dactyls, like you can do that basic stuff, but you want to know how to make it feel like it's just organic. You're not like necessarily following a pattern, but it's always there. And there's like a rhythmic sensibility, even though you're technically writing free verse. You really need to think about the distinction between meter and rhythm. They're not the same thing. Meter is about the expectation that a pattern produces moving forward, and rhythm is about how you manipulate that expectation. So, you know, the fact that you can use meter in your writing to produce an expectation about what comes next offers all these opportunities. So just one or two lines that are roughly in a meter allows you to go crazy, and do all kinds of things with syncopation, with broken space, with pause, all kinds of stuff. So that, I think, if I had to offer one bit of advice, is what I would suggest. Like, because you can learn basic scansion on your own time, even if you're not getting the resources in your MFA or in your undergrad program or whatever. But actually having somebody, explain then how that cashes out in contemporary poetics. If you're trying to write like a poem and you're not like a revivalist, you're not trying to write in form per se. You're not trying to write like a blank verse sonnet or something. You're trying to, do something that feels of a piece with what people are writing now. That is like, read Musicology. Specifically, there's a book by Justin London that's really good. I'm trying to remember the title, but it's about rhythm and meter and patterning, and it kind of understands. It led me understand this or conceptualize meter as like a surface and rhythm as a surface, and then they're interacting with one another, which is super useful, I think.
Yeah, I think it's really important when you start doing stuff like playing with space and why you do that, because you're actually also messing with the rhythm. You're mimicking, like you said, you're mimicking syncopation. Ironically, when I looked at your poem on difficulty, I also have a poem on difficulty, and I imagine it's inspired by the same fucking quote.
Yeah.
Like, so like I was like, oh, well, I'm not the only person who's written about this quote, but
so which quote are you thinking
of? I'm thinking of Jeffrey Hill's, just like
I was actually reacting to something from J.H. Prynne in that poem. J.H. Prynne has this essay on resistance and difficulty, and the difference between resistance and difficulty. And so I was thinking about that, that resistance is about what the writer experiences in producing the work, and difficulty is what the reader experiences. And on a certain level, like if the purpose of difficulty is that like it's the product of the resistance, but if the reader is experiencing like the resistance that the writer felt, then that's not good. Like, the difficulty that you're producing for the reader should be designed for the reader, if that makes sense.
Right. It basically shouldn't be, to put this in a bald-faced way, your therapy session for the difficulty of writing the poem itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I find that tension interesting, and I will say this: we both seem to be attracted to quote-unquote difficult poets. Reading your interviews, reading your book, it is clear to me that you draw inspiration from a lot of poets that would be considered difficult for a variety of reasons, some of which is metrical, some of which is Jeffrey Hill, yourself, Olson, as I mentioned earlier. They have no problem bringing up historical events in memory that they know you probably don't know. Like, and they're not going to make that easy for you. But I don't think it's there just to be difficult in your case or in Hill's case. I think it's there, go ahead.
Well, it's poems produce opportunities, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you are making an argument and you have to pause and explain what the historical event is that you're referencing, then you lose the contiguity between that historical event and the image that you're making, or another historical event that you're placing alongside it. And once you lose that, you lose the friction and the kind of, to use like the kind of sound that the friction makes. You can, the advantage of compression is that you can make connections that wouldn't otherwise be viable. But sometimes those connections are between two things that would otherwise need to be unraveled, right? So you can unravel them in a note, or you can let the reader Google it. There are multiple approaches. I do have a pretty, significant, kind of note apparatus in at the back of Seguiriyas, mm-hmm. for the purposes of making life a little bit easier for the reader. But yeah, my goal is, and I always say this, like I want that stuff to continue to, like that's never going to leave my poetry, that those kind of exacting elements. But I want the poem to be enjoyable regardless. Like even if you don't go to the back of the book and like figure out everything that's going on, or I want you to, I want there to be kind of like a sensuous enjoyment of the writing, whether it's like a vivid image that sticks in your mind, or the sounds, like that. That's really important to me, and I think it was important to Hill too. Like I started reading Hill when I was 14 years old, and
Impressive.
at that age, there was a lot of stuff I didn't understand, and I was not capable of like chasing down all those references. I didn't have the wherewithal to do so. And so, like I did some with some of it, but like a lot of my enjoyment of Hill, came with his phrase making, with the rhythms of his work, the way some of his metaphors stuck in my head. He really like was capable of these wholesale sensory enhancements that to me like that as much as like his ability to take history and bring it together and all this stuff like that, like to me, and theology, like to me, the like all of that stuff falls to the wayside if he didn't have first the sensory elements down. So like when I teach poetry, I'm like, be specific, build strange images that everyone will remember. Once you're specific and strange, and you're able to manipulate the senses, you can get away with like orders of magnitude more in your poetry.
Yeah, I always tell people poetry is not a riddle, but the riddles might be in there.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
And I think I like you're bringing up the semantic, because the semantic, because although I just may have portmanteaued an important word, but anyway, because I do kind of remind people poetry is a tactile medium, in the sense that it was originally made to be recited out loud, and its techniques were about memory. And then we add to that sensory language, and particularly, one thing I'm always telling kids, because I teach kids creative writing, is like, do not be afraid to be weird.
Yeah.
In fact, not only don't be afraid of it, try to be weird. And if you go too far, we can cut that back, as opposed to where if you use a bunch of cliches, I'm not going to have any real feeling for what you're actually trying to say, even though you're saying it directly. The feeling of the statement is not there.
Yeah.
And I do think you can get away with being really hard as far as like what you're pairing. Or Jeffrey Hill, I mean Hill Olson, another person that comes to mind that I know you're familiar with, is Oppen. You can get away with that if those poems still read in a way that is enjoyable, but you have to. It is an unfortunate side effect of the way we teach English to high schoolers, that they all think that the most important thing in a poem is basically semantic or didactic or rhetorical. Like they think the meaning is the thing that you should approach first. And I'm often like, no, even as a poetry writer, it's the thing you approach last. It's important, but it's like,
yeah. I mean, it might be the most important thing, but it's not the most important thing in the writing process. Like the poem springs from this like synaptic association that you're doing, that like sparks like a sensory feeling in your body, right? And then you like layer those and try to make sense of them, and that's when the semantic content emerges, right? But before you have the thing that's kind of beyond explication, you can't build the argument. I mean, that's what makes poetry kind of something that can't be replicated anywhere else. Like the distinction between like something that's poetic and a poem, I think would be that like something that's poetic, like makes use of things that would be proper to poetry in other contexts, but it doesn't spring from that initial connection, you know. So yeah, like but there's only so much you can do to convince people to start there. You know, there's
Right.
like I want to talk about my divorce. I always use the divorce example, partly because I teach people who like are way too young to be divorced. Um, uh, so for them, it's like funny. If I was like doing a continuing education class, I would probably choose a different example. But yeah, like if you just want to write about like how terrible your divorce was, that's your starting point. It's always just going to feel oppressive, right? Like because it's always just going to be, you know, here's the situation, here's my exposition, you know, like it's essentially following the same formula like a short story would follow. Um, and and for me, it's like, okay, no, like the first thing you have to do is take away the context from that feeling and figure out like the kind of strange sensation in your body that it produces and find a way to describe that sensation in and of itself and then relate that sensation back to the context. Um, if you can start from that kind of thing beyond sense, then the poem kind of spills out from there. That's how I feel, anyways.
I find myself fairly in agreement with that. I mean, I always think about, as a person who writes theory and philosophy, and I'm not quite sure I consider those things the same thing, but I don't want to go into the actual difference between theory and philosophy
Yeah,
right now.
right.
But that my writing style when I write that stuff is frankly god awful. Because it's so incredibly obnoxiously precise, because I was trained analytically and then I deal with all these continental concepts, so blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. And if I wrote a poem that way, you know, if I just broke up a paper into verse and cut out the citations, it would still be god awful. And for me, it's actually a tension. I remember when I was finishing my MFA and my thesis advisor was like, quit reading so much theory. And I was like,
Thankfully, nobody told me that. I feel like I got lucky there. But
well, I will say I did come from an MFA that was particularly anti-theory, which was kind of weird.
mine was kind of split across the middle. Like
mm,
workshops were hard because there are some people who are like, I don't care about ideas. And then there were other people who were like really deep into it. It was nice that we had a lot of flexibility to take courses outside the department. So like most of the courses that I took were like in like were theory classes in like comp lit and the French department, like various places. So you know that meant that actually like a lot of the poetry that I was writing was like, you know, me trying to work through all this other material that I was encountering, and people at my workshop were like, I like this isn't fair. Like you're not talking to us. Um, and so there was like a certain amount of breakdown there.
yeah, that makes sense. I had a similar tension where I was almost just basically accused of being an intellectual terrorist in my poetry. So
Oh yeah.
it's like, it was just like, quit referencing things we don't know. And I'm like, well, I was younger and even more of a jerk, so I'd be like, why don't you just read more? I don't know what the issue is here.
Yeah, I had that.
I wouldn't say that now.
I had that genetic makeup as well, I'd say. I have mellowed a little bit as well over time, but not in my work, just in my generosity towards other people. I'd say like I I think like the more I teach, the more I you know am really happy that you know people are using poetry to kind of work through their feelings, especially at the undergrad level when I'm like, you know, you get students who come into your office and they're like, you know, like writing poetry helped me work out my relationship with my dad. And I'm like, great, I want that. Like, I want that for you. But I think, you know, earlier on, I was much more of an absolutist. Like, you know, poetry must be like this, like serious intellectual pursuit. And now I just realized that, you know, it essentially it has boiled down to just different strokes, right? Like, I can't convince people who have come to poetry via, like, you know, Rupi Kaur or whoever to like what I like, but I can convince them to enter into this discourse and be influenced in various ways and to be exposed to various things that they otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to. And I find, you know, that at the end of the day, like, I'm just happy that they're there, which isn't something that I ever felt, I ever expected to feel when I was younger, but you know.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, one of my favorite things to do with the high school students in my creative writing class is to take Rupi Kaur and like actually try to make it interesting, because I don't think Rupi Kaur is a terrible poet, despite the fact that I make fun of her a lot. And after seeing where Instagram poetry went, I'm like, oh, Rupi Kaur's like a breath of fresh air, actually.
That's true. I mean, yeah, but you are, yeah.
You know, and then I also have to remind myself, I go back and look at like the best-selling poetry like since the 70s, and I'm like, oh yeah, that was like, when I'm complaining about Rupi Kaur in the 90s, it was Jewel. So like, I really should shut the fuck up.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was Jewel, and like, and then in the early aughts, it was Billy Collins, who you know,
I remember the Billy Collins era. I remember he came to my undergrad institution, and he said something that stuck with me. Someone asked, like, why are you always trying to be funny in your poems? And he said, there's nothing more honest that you can get out of a reader than a laugh, or something along those lines. And I was like, well, he's not wrong. Like, you know what? Like, I can't disagree. Like, I don't know how to dishonestly laugh by myself at a poem. But you know, that like it also kind of sidesteps the question a little bit.
I don't even know why I would either.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's not what I'm looking for per se. But.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I studied with him briefly when he was at Georgia Tech. Even though I was at a different school, but we would come and do workshops with him, and I actually found him to be a good moderating influence on my otherwise like penchant for obscurantism. So, but he was one of those people who actually mailed me out, because I was like, oh, once I understood what he was doing, I'm like, this is actually not easy to do, even if it's like deadpan comic timing and like relatively simple verse form.
Yeah.
Sometimes
I mean,
formal, sometimes not.
That was the moment for it, right? Like, he was like the public face of it, but like, you know, that was the same period when like all the writers were trying to emulate Dean Young,
right?
Who is kind of like the elevated version of what Billy Collins is doing in a lot of ways, in terms of like the way he uses timing.
Yeah, I can tell that we were in MFAs within a generation of each other, because everybody, including myself, was trying to emulate Dean Young.
I was in high school when that was happening.
Okay.
So yeah, within a generation. Like, when I started my MFA, when like everyone was obsessed with Ocean Vuong and Solmaz Sharif's Look, like that was those two books, like Night Sky with Exit Wounds and Look, were like I started my MFA in 2016. So that year, it was like it was the year of the personal is political.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, like we've gone back around to, but yeah.
Yeah. Which actually, you know, touches on some of the things that we can talk about with respect to the medieval stuff, if you want to shift in that direction.
I would want to go there, because like one of the things about your your poetry that I found interesting, and the reason why I brought it up when we were talking about medieval stuff, I know you do study like troubadours, and that's part of your comparative lit background, correct?
Yeah, it's part of my project. Like I'm like kind of this weird chimera of like philosophy and various literatures. Right now it's mostly Iberian, but like as like my undergrad was just an English lit. Like I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm putting some stuff together and trying to theorize complexity via literature and philosophy at the same time.
Yeah, as a person who's A, obsessed with complexity and ecology, B, also has a similar background to you in that I'm both educated in literature and creative writing and philosophy and anthropology. I actually was like, oh wow, our interests are very similar, and I discovered you not this you might find interesting. I discovered you twice. Once was I did a reading group with you at member school.
Right, there's the Jews and race in medieval Europe.
Right, yeah, and this whole like this like lit medieval emergence of our racial theories class that we kind of did very. It wasn't really a class, but it was also kind of more than just a book group.
Yeah,
But
we had it was like a 2-session thing, and so like Jules and I kind of co-led it, and we had a fun time with it.
And then I discovered you again separately, and it took me a second to realize you were the same person. Reading periodicities, which I read. I've actually had another guest on the show very recently, actually, who's published with periodicities too. And I saw your name again, and I was like, "Huh, I'm going to check this out." Oh, you published with Black Ocean. That's like one of my favorite presses. And then I was like, "What? You're the same guy I took that kind of discussion group with at middle school?"
Yeah.
Fuck. So. But yeah, and so to get into the medieval stuff, I am fascinated by early modern and late medieval poetry. And then going even back to the late antique poetry, like my favorite thing to mention is Nonus, and like I will admit my audience is like, who the fuck are you talking about? Like what, a 6th century Latin poet who may or may not have been a Christian but wrote about Dionysus, and may be the first depiction of explicit skin color based racism that we found in Western literature. Maybe, but we're not sure. Like that's the kind of stuff I think about, and I don't talk about it on my show much because my audience would be like, "What?" But I got the feeling you think a lot about late medieval poetry too, and particularly like the intersection between, let's say, folk poetry and folk music. And by that I don't mean like in the 20th century sense. I mean like in the 14th century sense. And kind of what we would consider today high art, and the way that they actually inform and intersect with each other. So how does medieval literature play on your work?
Well, I mean, so my academic work is kind of like subdivided in terms of eras. Like, so the troubadour stuff that I'm interested in is like the first 2 generations of the troubadours. So we're talking like late 11th through like late 12th century. I would like to be able to tell a story about how, medieval troubadour lyric might have bred certain kind of folk poetries, particularly the romances of the Iberian Peninsula, but there is no story to tell. It may or may not have, but like we have no way of knowing. And I'm just not in the business of speculating per se. So there are all kinds of theories about the origins of romances, which are kind of these late medieval forms. They arise kind of in the later medieval period or the early modern period. And they persist today. Like a lot of flamenco lyrics are in the form of romances, or in some cases are, repurposed romances. So one of the theories, for instance, is like there's this Arabic braided strophic form, the muwashakhat is the plural, and the muwashakhat incorporate, like what's called a kharja, which is like it's like in like a kind of it has a kind of structure that would translate well into like the octosyllabic romance, and also there were some kharjas that were written in Romance vernacular, and so like scholars have drawn connections between the kharja in the muwashakhat and the kind of evolution of the romances. However, like it seems tenuous to me. I mean, most of the kharjas were not in Romance vernacular. Most of them were just in vernacular Arabic, as opposed to like High Arabic. And yeah, so I mean, like, but there are like certainly scholars of flamenco who draw that connection so as to kind of institute this through line between like Arabic poetics and flamenco, and there's this desire to kind of claim these lineages. I'm suspicious of it, but the alternative to being to not to accepting that is to just accept that we can never know, which I suppose is unsatisfactory to many. But in any case, so that's like the way the project is divided is really just thinking about like these distinct spheres. The sphere of the 11th and 12th century troubadour lyric, the sphere of the early modern romances, which then are taken by Sephardic Jews who were expelled in 1492 to the diaspora, and they're perpetuated orally for centuries, to the point, and they're referred to as romanzas because it's in their Judeo-Arabic or Ladino, and sorry, Judeo-Spanish or Ladino, and the interesting thing is that like so many of these romanzas are actually more similar to like the earliest versions of romances that are being found than like the versions that exist in Spain in like more modern periods. So there's been like less variance, but one interesting element of variance is that like in certain cases these romances have been de-Christianized. So I want to explore that dynamic and also explore like the ways in which receptions work. Like some of the romanzas actually enter into circulation in the Sephardic diaspora well after the expulsion, because there are all these crypto Jews are kind of going back and forth between like the Christian communities and the Jewish communities, and are often in some cases even like converting back and forth as they go. But so that's like an element of what I do, and then the flamenco is like the most modern element of the literatures that I'm studying for my dissertation project. I kind of figured we'd focus on troubadour lyric because I think that there are some really interesting things to be said about subjectivity, and how it's structured in medieval literature, and then how we think about it in contemporary poetics. Because subjectivity is something that we take as a given when we write poetry now, right? And I'm fascinated.
Yeah, post Dante, anyway.
I think it's more modern than that. Like I really do.
Okay.
In the way that it's being done, and I'm interested in why, and what it does and where it comes from. Well, so the first thing is like, scholars of medieval troubadour lyric have been kind of, I think like the subjectivity side is one. Like the question is like, is there a subject in medieval troubadour poetry? Now, the reason why this is a question is because of the way troubadour poetry works. It's not just somebody, like some listeners might be familiar with the reputation of medieval troubadour lyric as like this, like so, some of the famous kind of tropes, like love from afar, like the pure love, fin amour, this idea of the like kind of like directing these like hyper romantic lyrics toward the woman who is the object of one's affection, etc., etc., like all of this stuff, right? Like the courtly love, like that's all from medieval troubadour poetry. So based on that, you think that it's like all these people just, wooing women by way of poetic expression in the courts of southern France and northern Spain and northern Italy. But the truth is actually kind of far away from that. That's part of it, but so where does medieval troubadour lyric come from? Well, it actually there's a great book by Cynthia Robinson called In Praise of Song, and in that book, Robinson kind of traces the movement of tropes from the Taifa kingdoms of Spain. So these independent Muslim courts that kind of emerged as the Umayyad Caliphate weakened. So in places like Toledo or in Saragossa, and so in these courts there are all these there is like also this kind of poetic practice that is happening in the inner sanctum of the courts. And one of the things that these poetic practices do is they kind of elevate certain and produce certain tropes with respect to like natural beauty and also with respect to like homosocial love. So, meanwhile, there are these, kind of nobles who are spending time in these Taifa courts and then returning to the south of France. And one of them is this William the Ninth of Poitiers, Guillaume Now in good right? And he is also the first recorded troubadour. He spent time in these Taifa courts, comes back, and all of a sudden, you see in the early troubadour lyric that a lot of these tropes with respect to natural beauty and with respect to love are being reproduced, but in a Christian context. They are being kind of, so instead of being rendered as homosocial, they kind of prop up the domina, the woman who's the object of love, as this figure who is the recipient of the pure love. And the ways in which it's deeply sexualized and sometimes satirical. The ways in which it's structured, like it's clear that there is a kind of, it is in some respects in the early period, kind of a parody of the tropes that people like Guillaume Now might have found in the Taifa courts. So it begins with this manipulation of tropes. What come to be known in scholarship as topoi, right? And as the topoi develop, troubadour lyric becomes this game where you arrange topoi in different ways, and your arrangement of the topoi produces like a commentary on what people have done previously, and also allows you to like dunk on your rivals and woo women and all kinds of different things, right? So the degree to which all of the troubadour poems are produced from a first person perspective, but the degree to which the I reflects like the troubadour is questionable at best, and it's unknowable. It might even have been unknowable at the time. And so this French scholar Paul Zumthor in the 70s was like, okay, there's just this circular recycling and reusing of topoi and of forms to produce kind of new arrangements. Like it's there isn't a subject here. Like there's no subjectivity. More recently, like people have identified actually like the arrangement, the ironizing arrangement of surfaces of topoi in the lyrics as actually a form of subjectivity. That it's the subject isn't in the poem, the subject is in the poem's arrangement, and it produces like an I outside of the I of the poem that is exerting a perspective that we can reconstruct. So there's a great book by Sarah Kay that deals with that. Now there are a couple of directions we can take this. The first is like, well, why does this matter in the context of troubadour lyric? Well, here's why it matters to me, or one of the reasons why it matters to me. So this actually refers back to something that we discussed in that group on Jews and race in medieval Europe. Do you remember the book The Singular Beast by Claudine Fabre-Vassas?
Yeah,
right?
I do.
So I will come back to that. But so one of the things that's happening in that Sarah Kay identifies in troubadour lyric is that there's actually three genders going on. There's the woman, the man, and the domna. Remember, the domna is like the object of affection. And so, femininity in medieval troubadour lyric is portrayed as like, being fickle, unreliable, venal, all these different, like, it's a bad thing for them. Masculinity is what you'd expect. And then the domna is this interesting kind of hybrid thing where you see like the status of masculinity being like masculine status being granted to the domna such that like the undesirable edges of femininity are kind of filed down and the femininity is rendered passive and pleasing. And so now we return to the Fabre-Vassas. So in that book, Fabre-Vassas is kind of tracing the ways in which the pig is integrated into symbolic, theological, familial, social practice in Christian Europe, right? And it's moving back and forth between the medieval and the modern. Anyways, one of the things that Fabre-Vassas observes is about baptism. So one of the purposes of baptism is to purify the child such that they might rise, they might be protected from this internal temptation that they experience. And the internal temptation is framed as a pig bone. The pig is kind of treated as a metonym for the Jew. So the idea is that there's this inner pig bone, which is also an inner Jewishness, and that baptism is supposed to overcome it. However, baptism is only able to overcome this pig bone or this inner Jewishness when, or only able to properly overcome it when it's a male who's being baptized. Why? Because women have these kind of quote unquote unregulated physical cycles, i.e. menstruation, that render them more similar to pigs naturally than men. So as a result, it becomes the baptized man's responsibility to protect the woman from, the negative influences of of, let's say, like actual Jews or lepers or people who are, excluded from the community, because the woman is much more suggestible and susceptible to that influence due to the fact that her inner pig and her, which is also her inner Jew, is not as suppressed as the Christian man's inner Jew or inner pig is suppressed. Let's return to the troubadour lyric stuff. Well, one of the things that the domna, the figure of the domna, suggests with the kind of masculine influence kind of curtailing these like negative feminine traits is that like there is this similar duty that masculinity has to protect the social interior and to control the kind of worse impulses of the feminine, such that the interior of Christian kinship might be protected from exterior pollution, right? So in a certain sense, the ways in which topoi are arranged and all of these tropes are set up is producing a social interior for the court, that the troubadour, by way of producing these poems, is actually able to bolster or control or contribute to, which then grants him status. And it's interesting then that also in fairly frequently, the ways in which the troubadour relates to the domna is described in terms that reflect, social roles within the hierarchy. Like they talk about there's an early lyric by Guillaume Now that they talk about, Gilliam now is like a kind of like a vassal on the charter belonging to the domna. Like, there's constant discussions of wanting to be the domna's servant, and there, all these different kinds of things, right? So, so the arrangement of forms produces a social interior, and bolsters a social interior. Or the arrangement of topoi, which is also kind of a formal practice, right? Now, the thing that I wanted to get into with respect to contemporary poetics and how this relates to contemporary poetics is that I think that subjectivity in contemporary poetics is a form. I don't think it's just us speaking from the heart. I think it's us using a form. And we use that form to produce a social interior in which the discourse surrounding, poetic subjectivity unfolds. That's the kind of idea that I'm working with. I think form is more diffuse than we give it credit for. Like when we talk about form now, we're talking about like, a sonnet or a villanelle or what have you. And there is that element of form, and that element of form existed for the troubadours too. I mean, like Arnaud Daniel, a famous troubadour, was the one who invented the sestina, right? The canso is its own form. There's a really interesting form called the discourt, which is just it produces chaos, and a famous discourt by Rimbaud de Vaqueras actually, has like each stanza is in a different language, and then the final stanza is each line is in one of the languages. Dante actually plays around with kind of correspondences to that. But in any case, the point being, like, there are those kinds of forms in troubadour lyric too, but there are also like tropes that take on formal significance that are being repurposed and that are indexing, this broader tradition, and they're being used not just as like symbols, but really as like these like set slides that are being placed on top of one another, like literal topoi surfaces, right? And I think we could bring back that conception of form. I think it's still operative for us. In a recent in his recent book Optic Subwoof, Douglas Kearney talks about form as basically just an enclosure. So he talks about like just if two things chime and produce like a symmetrical relation that encloses the work that you're doing, that's a form of that is a form. And form always produces a containment, right? And this containment can sometimes index violence. It often is a kind of violence. And that got me thinking about subjectivity, because subjectivity is in a sense a correspondence between the I ascribed to the poet and the I being received, the lyric I being received by the reader, right? That's the enclosure that contains the rest of the poem, but it also then implicates the audience and implicates the poet. And I think we perform subjectivity in our poems because it's a form to which we ascribe. It's the same as choosing to write a sonnet. Choosing to be a subject in a poem is a choice. It's not just something that we automatically do. It's a choice, but it's a choice that's because not everyone makes that choice, by the way. There are some really interesting poets out there who choose not to make that choice, who choose not to be subjects in that way. But it is a choice that has become like so ubiquitous that it feels like it's not a choice anymore. And I wonder what the implication, like, I wonder if we could talk about the implications of that, if you think that even tracks.
Oh, I think there's a lot of implications of it. One of the things I've thought a lot about is the performance of authenticity, which I think we see in daily life now. But I do think we can accuse poetry of going back to at least the 1950s.
I was going to bring up like Robert Lowell's life studies and Plath and
Plath, Sexton.
Yeah.
And I mean, I even got to the point where I was like, man, this is almost a form of like human sacrifice built into it, because most of these people end up actively destroying themselves for the performance of their art in a way that seems almost constructed.
Right. Well, and then you people like look where I'm like it feels like it feels like, you know, like a post self-destruction subjectivity in Louise Gluck's work. Like there's
right.
just something that's so like it's almost like a like a voice that's detached from oneself so as to relate the self. Like that the only way to relate the self after it's been sacrificed is to like distance oneself enough that you can, you know, produce this sensibility of like unyielding impartiality. Um, and then there's the other way around. You get like someone like Jack Gilbert, who's just like, you know, like completely narrating his own very moving self-destruction with respect to the death of, you know, his wife Michiko, you know, those famous poems from the Great Fires and from Refusing Heaven. Ocean Vuong as well. Like, you know, for me, like that my mind first leapt to Night Sky with Exit Wounds, because it was so like, you know, that it was the book when I entered into the MFA, which, you know, naturally meant that like I and many others, like, you know, while we could admire Vuong's talent, we also got very sick of that book, right? Because it was everywhere and everyone was talking about it. But you know, there are these poems in there where he addresses himself, literally just, you know, saying his own name, like the apostrophe as a performance of subjectivity, as like this unveiling of the self, and then like, you know, alienation of the self into the third person, such that like you feel like, you know, in addressing himself, Vuong is also addressing you as the reader. You know, that kind of thing is to me like such a formal, like it's such a like it's such a it unveils, you know, this you know, choice towards, you know, having a subjectivity in a poem as, you know, what like an immutably formal decision. And in fact, there are, you know, there is medieval literature that does a similar thing. Like, you know, there are texts where like often, you know, like Jewish converts to Christianity would write texts that, you know, consist of a debate between their former selves with their Jewish name and their current selves with their Christian name. You know, this same kind of apostrophic or dialectic kind of movement, that, you know, exteriorizes the self such that, you know, the reader can feel like, you know, they are also, in being talked to, are you, which, you know, like, I don't know, I there's something there. I don't know what's to be done. I don't know if anything needs to be done about it, but I just think it's important to recognize that like that what this is doing, it's not just like a technical decision or a formal decision that, like, you know, we make or we unmake or whatever. It also produces a social interior.
Right.
That it circumscribes like what we understand poetic sociality to be, how we relate to our peers, how poets relate to one another, how readers relate to poets, how poets relate to readers. You know, the whole apparatus of what we do, when we get up and at an open mic in front of the microphone, or at a reading, or, you know, we go to AWP and we, you know, do whatever it is that we do. We have panels about whatever it is. Like, it's all just this subjectivity thing that we're doing. Should we try to escape it? I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I have a philosophical bias that all selves are created anyway.
Yeah, right.
So,
I mean, I agree. Like, ontogenesis is like, yeah, you can't. I don't think you can have like a complexity theory without thinking through ontogenesis. So,
right. So, so I do think a lot about it, and I think a lot about it as the way I worry about it, because there is a way in which, and I don't think Ocean Vuong's actually guilty of this, but a lot of Ocean Vuong imitators are.
oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's
Where
always the imitators, right?
right. Where the self is constructed as a political self, or like that is constructed as a political act, but it is hollowed out, and yet this idea of a political character of a set of interiorities that you step into and step out of is foreclosed for a lot of these poets. So like the idea that, for example, this self is a character self that I am stepping into because the role of which I have to play, either artistically or even socially, that there is this weird obsession with authenticity and a lot of this stuff that also in a strange way hollows out the relationality, and thus creates a kind of very, to me, flat social interior. And it's one of the few things where like when I'm reading new poetry, I sound like an old guy just yelling at the clouds, because I'm just like this is like your deep inner feeling, and yet somehow I also feel like there's not a whole lot there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's because it only gives you the option to agree or disagree, right? It's either like you validate my experience and therefore agree with what I'm saying, because what I'm saying like isn't like an argument that you can necessarily disagree with. It's just like, this is me, this is who I am, and you you can read it and acknowledge it, and then say like, yes, I see you, I'm making space for you. But like yeah, like I don't know how to respond to that work apart from doing that. Like I just, like there's not much else to say, like because yeah, the main the main thing that it offers is authenticity, and I don't think either of us is arguing that like authenticity is bad.
No, I don't think it's bad. I might think it's impossible,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's bad.
Yeah, right. Like we want to be genuine. You know, even if it's impossible, we still should want it, right? It's more
Agreed.
like, you know, that can't be the only thing you're selling.
Right. Well, I don't know. I agree with you. My most cynical self says this is a product of the workshop, because if you make your artistic expression about yourself, any critique of the artistic expression is critique of the self, and thus is an act of violence, and thus we're going to forego all critique whatsoever.
Yeah. Or just like the workshop questions, like you know, if you write authentically about yourself and your life and your struggles, you know, all of which are worthy material, don't get me wrong, but if you do that, nobody can ask you what are the stakes of this poem. In workshop, that question only exists for poems that are about things other than that. And I guess like my perspective is that like there should be like, first of all, the what are the stakes of this poem question should be retired, but also you know, like I don't know that it's any less valid to you know, like try to think through like a thorny question relating to like theology than there is to try to think through like, you know, like a trauma that you experienced. Like I just like, I don't know why like we should have to ask the stakes of one and not the stakes of the other. Like, or we could just not ask that question at all, I suppose. But and then the other thing is like, you know, going back to like the divorce example, it's like, you know, lots of people get divorced, right? What is it about your divorce that, you know, makes it worthwhile for me to read about as a reader? Like, and you know, when that's about divorce, it feels less callous, or like a breakup, it feels less callous of a question than it is when it's a question about like, you know, somebody's trauma, right? But at the end of the day, like, you know, so many people experience trauma. Like, what is it about this particular trauma and the way it's being framed that makes it like, you know, different? And I don't mean that I'm not saying that the content of it should be different, but like what you're doing with it, where you're going with it. Like, there needs to be an argument. It can't just be enough to say like, this is who I am, this is what I've experienced, say yes to the text. And so that's I think like something that's hard to talk about, because like in workshop, like if I say that in workshop, somebody's gonna be very upset.
Oh yeah,
And
I mean,
for a good
it's almost
reason, because like, yeah, you are calling their experience, you are saying that your experiences are not significant enough for me, and that's not really the content of the critique, but it's the unavoidable place where that critique is going to go once it's interpreted in a particular way. So
absolutely.
I think there's like a dual problem. One of the problems is like the authenticity thing, but the other problem is the pedagogy surrounding all of this. That we need to find ways to have conversations about the work that doesn't put people's traumatic life experiences on the chopping block, like when you're critiquing a poem. And it's hard. Like it's hard when you're teaching to do that. Like it's hard to read a student's poem and say, oh, here are all these things that you're not doing that would make this poem like a lot more interesting, without saying, oh, your trauma is boring. Right.
No, it is a challenge, because it is sort of you are sort of like, how can we pull these more interesting images out, our sounds, our semantic experiences out of you, where I'm also being like, and you're writing about one of the worst things of your life, and I'm trying not to come at it, but you're not, frankly, you're not portraying the worst event of your life very well.
Right. Yeah. It's so delicate, especially with, well, you'd think especially with younger students, but I actually think like once younger students get used to it, they bounce back better. But with people who like live with stuff for a long time and like feel like they're ready to tell their story, it's actually harder. But yeah, I think that a way of framing things is like making people understand like an argument doesn't have to be this like hyper intellectual thing where you're like pulling all these like like pieces like and putting them together in like these fascinating ways and like building this intricate series of claims, or anything like you can have a sensory argument that's going along with your account of the trauma that frames it in such a way that we understand how trauma works in the sensorium, and that's an interesting argument. So the logic of your poem could be like a sonic logic, a visual logic, any kind of thing. It doesn't have to be this hyper intellectualized thing, but the key is that like subjectivity can't be the only form. Like if subjectivity is a form, then just like the topoi for the medieval troubadours, it's a form that's in dialogue with other forms, with other arrangements of other topoi, right? So you have to be strategic about that. Like the subjectivity can't subsume all of the other topoi.
Yeah, I mean, I both agree with you, and also I'd be like, me telling people that is not gonna happen in a workshop. I mean, maybe this is a critique of the workshop as the primary way of teaching poets, though, because I have sort of thought about it.
Yeah, I've thought about it too. I've taught like workshops that aren't workshops before, and in some ways they went better. In some ways, in other ways they went worse though. Like I feel like there should be workshops, but there should also be like anti-workshops.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we both went through programs that had a lot of other coursework in it, but there are these MFA programs, even some PhD programs of creative writing that are like 90% workshop. Right, I'm just like,
I would not have been able to do that. Like I would have left the program. I found workshop to be like so demoralizing. Not even because like I wasn't even like getting these super negative reactions to my poems. It just felt like I was running in place.
Yeah,
I wasn't learning things, and it wasn't even the teacher's fault or the fault of my peers. It was just the setup. Like I found that I learned things when I went out and studied things. and then like the workshop was at best this like referendum on like whether or not like how I was executing my technique was effective.
Yeah. I'm not gonna say I've never gotten anything out of a workshop. That's not true, but there has been a lot of times where I've been like, I don't know, I got more from memorizing this bunch of poetry and like internalizing its soundscape. I mean, I remember, for example, just memorizing like 5 dream songs and like really memorizing them and like understanding and how they worked, both in a way to remember them, but also in a way to like construct and deconstruct their arguments, the kind of constructive subjectivities of those poems, what's going on, you know.
Yeah, and of course you can
Why
turn it
are
over
they
in your head
racist?
once you can
Go ahead, yeah.
yeah, the racism of John Berryman. But once you can turn a poem over in your head, you like without having to look at it on the page, like it starts to make sense in a different way because you can imagine saying it, if that makes sense. Like
Right.
your voice suddenly enters the poem, and the way it modulates for you is like, you know, all of a sudden like you can see how certain things are intended in ways that you can't if you're just reading it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's just me trying to remind people that there's a deception about and I write pretty visual poetry, but there's a deception about poetry on the printed page that you approach it like you'd approach prose or like you'd approach art, visual art or plastic art, which is somewhat helpful, but usually not how the thing actually works. But also, traditional poetry does take advantage of the printed page in a way that, like, for example, performance poetry doesn't. Like, for like a subtle argument is going to be much harder in performance poetry because you can't reread it.
Yeah.
Like, which is a lot of times why there's a lot of slam poetry, for example, that I really like when I hear it, but when I read it, I'm like, oh my god, I could take half this poem out, like, and it would.
Yeah, no, it's
Maybe.
true. It's a different form. Like
Right.
troubadour poetry is actually interesting because it was like, written to be heard, but it relied on people recognizing things. Like it's like, oh, like that's like if you're like, a troubadour
Well, I
in
mean, it
like
was
the mid
kind of
12th
like
century,
mimetic in
and
that
then
way.
yeah, exactly. Like yeah, like people will be like, oh, that's from like Gilliam now, like 50 years ago, and he's like kind of renovating this trope and like using it in a cool new way, like, and so then you get the applause for being like this like super well trained artist who's, like kind of playing with the tradition in clever ways, right? Like slam poetry is not the kind of thing that does that, as far as I'm aware. It could. I mean, that would be
There are a
cool.
few authors that
Yeah.
do, but not many. Like,
Yeah.
Patricia Hill will sometimes. But the funny thing is, once you start doing that, you're often no longer considered a slam poet.
Right. Yeah. Like all of a sudden you're like there are all kinds of like really good contemporary poets who like started out in the slam space and kind of migrated over to the page, and their work on the page, it's not that it's not meant to be read out loud. It really is, but it takes on this much more textual element. The oral textual tension in poetry is something that we've never been able to escape. Like I don't think that like logocentrism has totally won out in poetry ever.
No. Yeah, no. I actually find it quite interesting when I would read Derrida and I'd be like, I don't think poets do this. Like,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
we're very ambiguous about this whole printed word versus spoken word thing. um
Yeah, we're
there are
trying to figure it out.
right.
Ever since poetry has been written down, we've been trying to figure it out. Like, and none of us, because the thing is, we can't control how somebody else will read the poem out loud, and all we
No.
want to do is to control that. Like half the time when I'm using blank space in my poems is because I want the poem, the reader to be reading the poem at my pace, But I can't ever know that they'll do that.
Right.
It's just these futile attempts at control.
Actually, this was one of these things that I started playing with in my own performances back when I was in MFA. Is I get frustrated with people not getting why I was doing spacing for readings, so I just started like ignoring my own reading marks in reading the poem twice, once with just like,
Oh my God.
like pretending I didn't know what I was reading on my own poetry, and then the other would be like to try to hit that's the timing right.
Oh, you
And
must have made so many friends.
I was such a passive aggressive fucker. But it was, it was one of these frustrating things that I even remembered, like, and it was interesting to do actually, because you realize even I can't always reproduce.
Yeah, no. Every time I read my own poems, they're different. So I can't.
Right.
Yeah, I can't control myself, let alone another person. But
Right. Like I put all the stops here so you could tell, and even I can't always make it work. So yeah. I I, I need to wrap this up, but
yeah.
have really enjoyed this conversation. Where can people find your work?
I have a website, which is probably the easiest way to do it. And I guess I'm on like some of the social medias. I'm on Blue Sky, but I mean I post like once every 2 months. So you should check out my website. What is it? Is it benmeyersonmedia.com? Let me make sure that's benmeyersonmedia.com. Yeah.
And I will put a link in the show notes. So
yeah. Also come hang out at Mimbra School, and you can probably find both of us.
Yeah, we're around. All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.